Hello and welcome to Strong Conversations. Oh my gosh, it's been so long that I feel like I need to just do like the full intro thing because I feel like I haven't been on this platform in forever. And for that, I apologize. I am Dr. Carolyn Strong, and welcome to Strong Conversations Hot Takes from a Cultural Firebrand. That would be me. I am an educator. I am a national thought leader regarding DEI and anti-racism, whatever those words mean now. And I am also an educator that focuses on school equity. And with that being said, there was no way that everything that's happened over the last week could have happened and me not say anything. Like I said, the platform has been pretty quiet because I've been trying to do some restructuring, but no, not today. And there's no other day than to do it than on in Independence Day. Independence, freedom for everybody and we all get to be the same and have all the rights, all the rights. So again, for those of you that are new to the platform, we just have a conversation. And I am once again joined by one of my favorite guests, Dr. Tiffany Monfort Dent. But as we typically do on this platform, you are the you expert. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself. And then after you do that, we'll just jump right into our conversation. Thank you again on this here Independence Day.
I thank you for having me. And for those who are watching, I just want to make sure you like and subscribe to Dr. Strong's YouTube channel. Click those buttons, get your notifications for when she does come back. You'll be able to see it at the bottom. I am Dr. Tiffany Dent. I am a licensed psychologist. I call myself a Black psychologist for the culture because in the work I do in my private practice and in my consulting and in my workshops, I prioritize the needs of my community. I do a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically in social justice spaces, addressing the emotional wellness of Black and Brown communities, specifically around issues of culturally informed practices, and addressing vicarious racial trauma, racial justice, racial healing. And here we are in another situation that the communities that I love are going to have to deal with. So thank you for having me.
Of course. And you know what? I've made myself this note time and time again, but I think I'm going to have to invite you back so that we can do and spend a full show unpacking vicarious racial trauma, what that looks like, how it impacts communities of color, how it manifests in schools. That's always where I'm going to look first because that's just where I sit, how it impacts schools and then larger society. But having said that, we are here today on this Independence Day, so that we can talk about some of, and I say some of because there were more, but Hot Takes from a Cultural Firebrand is only a 30-minute show, so we had to narrow it down to two of the Supreme Court rulings over this last week that have us scratching our heads and wondering what comes next. So I want to take some time to talk about two rulings. The first being Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and UNC et al., which was impacting affirmative action. And then we have 303 Creative LLC versus Elena's, which is impacting the rights of the LGBTQ community. So let's start off with affirmative action. But again, the educator in me does not allow me to start talking about things before we're all working from the same definition. So with that being said, I want to take 2 seconds to define what affirmative action is and what it looks like. So for our purposes, the definition that we're going with for affirmative action is a policy that's aimed at increasing workplace and educational opportunities for people who are underrepresented in various areas of our society. Now, how that has manifested over the years has typically been women and people of color and, well, Black and brown people. because people of color is a term that sometimes can get problematic, but I digress. Now, what everybody's favorite Clarence Thomas has proposed is that instead of utilizing affirmative action, which he says can be harmful, we need to adopt something called a race neutral policy. And what he said, I had to write it down. What he said was that by stating race neutral policies, by starting race neutral policies, we can achieve the same benefits of racial harmony and equality without any of the burdens and strifes generated by affirmative action. So,
I think one of the things, because in your definition of affirmative action, I think when we say underrepresented, I prefer historically excluded. Because when we talk about historically excluded, it goes against everything that people are trying to say is the reason why we no longer need affirmative action, right? Including the wonderful Clarence Thomas, in the sense of there have been systems, practices put in place to keep certain communities from having access. Right. So if we're saying that versus underrepresented puts this framework like it's our fault, right? Like we just choose to not do something versus there have been strategic things put in place to exclude us, to keep us from having that access. And that's part of what affirmative action was supposed to do. It recognized we have for centuries put things in place to keep certain communities from having access based upon their race. And so in that, we know that they're coming from 5 and 6 strides back, and that we have to acknowledge this to also begin to shift some of our practices that are continuing because of those practices are entrenched within our universities. They're entrenched within our other systems to keep them from having access. So we have to acknowledge that we have done things to keep them out. And so now we have to look at our practices that make it more fair, that give them the opportunity to have access. Because it's still about opportunity, right?
absolutely.
We still have to show up and be able to demonstrate that we deserve to be in those spaces. But when you're going to schools, when you are making sure that school districts have less funding, less resources, when you are only seeking out and acknowledging certain schools that we're not able to get into in terms of high schools as those that are good enough, that's a part of that historical exclusion. And so part of it was acknowledging and trying to address some of that. So underrepresented is us. Historically excluded is what you have done to us.
Right. And I guess then the way we can look at it and reframe it, because again, one thing that I think we don't fully understand, or not understand, but accept and act on, is the fact that language matters. And even in that, we're saying, like you said, underrepresented, but even in that, that is the impact. That's not a definition. That's the impact. That's the result. The underrepresentation is a direct result of being historically, and I would even go as far as to say intentionally excluded.
Absolutely.
So it's like, yes, it was historic, but it wasn't an accident. It was by design. And so when we talk about that part, and I guess I'm kind of jumping ahead, because one of the things that I did kind of want to talk about is how does this understanding of the fact that this has been very intentional over the years, and B, how do we now put that with this new race neutral definition that is saying we can have racial harmony and equality? How do we how do we eliminate equity and then go straight to equality? How does that work? How does that shift happen?
It doesn't. And the goal of this current Supreme Court and many of the people who are supporting these policies is not for that to be the case. There is not this goal of equality, right? There is not this wanting us to be successful, wanting us to have the opportunities. If anything, it's the exact opposite. Clarence Thomas knows this is not true. The justices know this is not true. And so we have to acknowledge that this is not by design to actually get us to a point of equality. Because again, you can't get to equality when you have not addressed the ongoing systemic issues that are making it more difficult for certain communities of color to have access to the resources, to the networks that they need in order to be seen for the possibility of admission. Because again, they're not letting in Black students with 2.0 GPAs to
Right.
Harvard. It's not happening. They are Black students who are excelling, but you aren't looking for them. So the goal is not for us to be okay. The goal is to, as much as possible, continue to turn back the hands of time to make sure that Black and brown people have less access to certain levels of higher education and networking that comes with those higher education.
Well, I mean, I guess it would be one thing if it were just higher education.
Right. It's not
But
going to end there.
but as we know, it's starting here, but it's not
Mhm.
going to end here, because what happens is then it trickles down.
Mhm.
And then you have those schools, those secondary schools that have the rigor and all of
Mhm.
these processes that now may very well fall in line and say, if we don't have to do this to be willfully diverse, then we don't have to do this to be willfully diverse. And so I guess for me, one of the things that comes up for me is that in doing this, we've kind of literally pushed back the hands of time to Plessy versus Ferguson. Was that 1854? I
And
think Plessy v. Ferguson was 1854. And that was the case that had separate
separate
but
but
equal.
equal.
And so one of the arguments over this whole time, and one of the arguments that I've seen coming down my timeline, and we've had this conversation, is okay, well, now it's time for us to move back to HBCUs. So, and I've seen some things that were saying if they don't want our scholars, we shouldn't be sending them our athletes and all of those things. And now there's this secondary push for Black people to send their students to HBCUs, which I have no problem with. But what are the implications of this on the funding for those institutions?
And I am a proud HBCU alum. I love my
You
HBCU. It
do.
was the best experience and choice for me. My child is going to an HBCU. I come from a family of HBCU alums. I think the issue is that we are making this is not the end. Because as you're sitting here and trying to talk about affirmative action in college admissions, it's going to be hitting everything. We also know that there's legislation that are going around at state levels about not giving funding to something that appears to be more diversity, equity, and inclusion based and race based, which are HBCUs. Our HBCUs have been historically underfunded. They are. We have state funded, historically Black colleges and universities, which means they are supposed to be funded by the state, just like their white counterparts. They do not traditionally get the money that they are owed. You know, recently, one of the presidents of Tennessee State University talked about, she mentioned, you owe us millions of dollars that you have failed to give us as a state institution. So we can sit here and I love my HBCU. I would love to see Black students experience HBCUs. We also know, though, that the way that historically states have done, they have not funded the HBCUs the way they're supposed to. HBCUs do not exist solely on tuition. Infrastructure, buildings bear names of people for reasons, because that is about people donating tons of money, philanthropists giving money to HBCUs or to PWIs, also states putting in money to support these institutions. Do we really think that these same people who are pushing this idea of trying to exclude us as much as possible in as many arenas as possible are going to provide the funding to HBCUs? They are not. It's going to be a separate but equal. And we know the reason why we looked at integration was not because we said, if you were funding our schools the way you should, we would be happy to be in our schools. But you were making concerted efforts to not.
Right.
And
It
so
was
we
it was
have to
never equal.
recognize that we're looking at this short term and saying, yay, just come to our HBCUs. And again, love my HBCUs, would love to see as many students as possible, specifically Black students, have that experience. But if we think that our students coming to HBCUs are going to allow for this separate but equal, it's not. They're
Right.
not going to fund it.
Oh, I do need to backtrack. I had my date wrong. It was 1896.
Okay.
Plessy v. Ferguson was 1896, and then it was reversed, overturned
Mhm.
in 1954 with Brown
Brown
versus
versus
Board of
Board of
Education in Topeka, Kansas.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure where this students for fair admissions versus these universities puts us on that Plessy v. Ferguson Brown continuum.
And
I don't even really
I
know.
think for our HBCU students who are lauding this, they think we're going to separate but equal. But we also know that even when we have been proven to be able to do well, the systems, white supremacy comes in and tries to take everything we fought for. So we can sit here and even when we say, well, we used to have our own neighborhoods, we used to have our own entire cities and commerce, they burned that down. They did not let us have it. So we also need to be mindful of that, and that this is not that short-term excitement about, yay, come to HBCUs. This, we're looking at this in terms of affirmative action. This is on this timeline of where do we go next? Are we going to
Right.
then address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace? Are we then going to have someone come in and say, hey, when you're putting out these statements as corporations saying we value diversity within our workplace, are they going to then be told that they can't look for diverse candidates? And then we're going to go back to cis white men in most of or all of the positions because there's not now this push or this belief that diversity matters.
Right. So I guess my next question along those same lines, well, not question, but just a comment, because I think it was the same day or the very next day there were 4 Black women who were in major corporations as their DEI leaders all exited those corporations.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure what that means moving forward. Because when somebody resigns or when somebody steps down, we never truly know
Mhm.
the
The reason.
the reason. We never truly know what happened behind the scenes until the NDA expires and the memoirs come out.
Mhm.
So it just, the timing of it and the number just seemed fairly odd to me. And I don't know if you have thoughts regarding that.
And I think my overall thought about this situation around affirmative action and kind of on this continuum of how it's going to affect issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think when we're looking at our community and just the underlying belief that we're not wanted, right? And how does that affect you as a person going into a university, a person going into a workplace, when you now know that there are even these measures that have been put in place to try to make the workforce, to try to make the school setting a place where you feel somewhat comfortable, no longer is going to be the case, because even the JED Foundation said 27% of Black college students report that they do not feel psychologically safe on college campuses, that they feel psychologically unsafe. And that was in 2022. And so now we are
Can you
in this
unpack what psychologically unsafe
where
means?
they don't feel like that they belong. They don't feel like that when they're kind of out and about in this college environment that they can that their opinions matter, that the people around them value them as students, or that even as we've noticed in some of the college campuses, when college students have talked about, I was just sleeping in the lobby of my dorm
Oh, I
and the police
remember
came,
that.
right? And so now if we're sitting here and we are pretty much saying that we are now going to put in place things that are going to make it even less of you on these campuses, what is that going to look like? And one of the arguments is always, well, then no one will question your merit. Let's be clear. People are always going to question whether Black and brown folks deserve to be in a space. That's not going to
Absolutely.
change. It's just going to be less of you there to commiserate with each other about how
Right.
much we belong. So I think that's that piece of it, is that we are now, as we're making these decisions on where we choose to go, whether it's in the workplace, or whether it is in the school setting, that being even more alone, and then also knowing that there are places you deserve to be, and they're going to again not look for you.
Okay.
And the fact that, I think one of the things we cannot kind of, as we talk about BIPOC, is we have to acknowledge that it was a group of anonymous Asian American students who filed this lawsuit. And it
Mm.
wasn't about legacy admissions, which are still allowed. It was not about white students who were getting into the university. It was about Black and brown students. Like, this is this kind of need for us to have this like intra-minority relationship, right? That they're talking about that really puts us into this BIPOC area. And where does that struggle now look like for communities of color when we are struggling to identify and recognize, I am not your enemy. I am not the person who is oppressing, marginalizing, or taking something from you. And until we kind of figure that out, what is that also going to look like for our students on campus when they're constantly putting us together as communities of color?
Well, I guess, well, that's twofold. So I guess when we start talking about this notion of communities of color, how do we effectively have those conversations so that we can fix the interminority relations while still actively acknowledging that no matter who brought it to the Supreme Court, the very premise is still rooted in white supremacy.
And I think part of it is we have, as communities of color, we have to begin to acknowledge that white supremacy is a hell of a drug, and that there are many within our communities who choose to try to increase their proximity to whiteness as much as possible, to have honorary whiteness, to get differential privilege because I am not as minority as you, that we have to acknowledge that that's actually happening. Because what happens a lot of times within communities of color is we've bought into some of these negative stereotypes about other communities of color, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we sit here and say, I didn't get into Harvard because of the Black student. This Black student didn't deserve to be here. But I'm not going to pay attention to the fact that like over 30% of Harvard admits are legacy admissions, which are not those Black students, right? I'm not going to pay attention to that. I'm not going to come over here and question whether or not they deserve to be here. I am going to question whether or not this Black student deserves to be here. And part of that is open and raw conversations, because we know one of the things, especially around Black women, is that we constantly show up for everybody, knowing we're going to benefit the least. We showed up in times of when there were Asian hate happening. We have shown up when we've talked about deportation that was disproportionately impacting brown communities. We showed up when it came time when we were talking about the Dakota pipeline and the kind of trying to kick Native American folks off of their land. We show up, right? And so part of it is that until all of our communities recognize consistently that they're going to come for you once they've already eliminated or excluded me. It's not. So if you're sitting here and thinking that this is going to be the case, we're going to look at increasing legacy admissions, right? We're going to make where you're going to see it as a wider campus. It's not necessarily that they're going to allow you to fill that space.
Right.
There's going to be these other measures that are put in place, but the people you're choosing to exclude or that you're worried about are the ones who are taking up like 15%,
I was
not
going to
the
say the
40,
least amount of
50%,
space.
the least amount of space. Because you have bought into the belief that Black and brown students are not as smart as you.
Right.
Because white supremacy has said the darker you are, the less intelligent, the more inferior you are.
Right.
And you bought into that. Those plaintiffs who have brought this forward and those organizations that have chosen to support them. And I want to acknowledge that there have been Asian American organizations that have sided with Harvard and also did amicus briefs to say we ain't a part of this because of that recognition, right? But there were also, this was brought by a group of anonymous Asian students along with some Asian American organizations who also supported them and saying we need to exclude Black and brown folks because that's who you're excluding. Let's just be honest. That's who you were coming for.
Absolutely. And so, but even in that, I think that part of what's happening is that sometimes, even though we need to be very intentional about defining things, we also need to be very intentional about defining what they aren't. Mm-hmm. And so I think that when we had our definition of affirmative action from before. It's a policy aimed at increasing workplace educational opportunities for people who have been historically and intentionally excluded in various areas of our society. We also need to be intentional about talking about what affirmative action isn't. And what affirmative action isn't is taking someone that's not qualified and putting them in a space simply because they are Black or brown, for a space that a white qualified student could have had. That's not what affirmative or employee even could have had. And I think that when we start this whole notion of kind of gaslighting and trying to galvanize against these systems, those are the types of language that we start to hear being used about, well, all you're going to do is just put an unqualified person in the space because affirmative action. And it never worked that way. Even with affirmative action, Black and brown communities are still working twice as hard to get half as much.
Especially when we're oftentimes coming from this historical and intentional exclusion, where we come from the fact that you automatically undervalue the places where we live because we live there. Right. And in doing so, you then set up systems where a lot of the school districts are funded based upon property taxes. But since you have decided that if a Black person lives in that home, it's worth less, then that's less money for that school district, right? So we've already put these things in place that have made it more difficult for these specific communities. And we know that this does not, and I think the thing is that this does not, because it's affirmative action, it doesn't impact legacies. Right. It's not impacting the ones who are really able to come in with less qualifications oftentimes because they are legacies or because their grandfather or dad's name is on the building.
Absolutely.
So,
but we'll never address those things. So
because we don't look at them as the problem.
Like
we have these blinders on, that we have bought into these beliefs that Black and brown students specifically are not qualified to be in these spaces, knowing that they're not coming in to Harvard with 2.0 GPAs. That's not what's happening. They're coming in with the similar GPAs and scores or better than your legacies that you don't care about. And they've worked a lot harder to get there because there is not oftentimes as much access to the resources, because intentionally those resources have been taken from them or not allowed for them to have access to.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's also low hanging fruit, right?
It
You're not going after the legacy.
No,
you're not going after the people whose names are on the building, because you fully recognize the power that those people wield, and you're not trying to enter that space. So we do still have another case to address.
And I just wanted to add one last thing.
I was about to ask what else
when we were talking about kind of just the emotional health, we also know that inclusive community connections are the best indicators for improving youth mental health, right? And so when we're looking at our emerging adults going into these institutions that are now going to be even less welcoming and less inclusive for them, unless they're able to do a workaround, we are now also looking at, then we're going to be able to be worried not just about their academic success, but their emotional success being in these spaces, because that community and those connections are less likely to be available to them.
So I guess in closing that up, one of the things, and I don't know that this has been unpacked yet overall, because, this just happened. I guess what we need to be looking for moving forward is this a directive, or is this just, you don't have to, but you will still have those institutions that are still going to be intentional about their willful diversity? Even though the government is now saying you don't have to do this, are there still going to be spaces that are saying we don't have to, but we will?
And there have been, Harvard has already put out a statement about how they are committed to trying to make sure that their campus is diverse, and they are trying to figure this out. I think other schools have also released statements about their commitment to a diverse student body. One of the difficulties is, they said that race can be a factor, but you have to kind of do something and write something that says race has impacted your life, that it can't just be because you're Black. It has to be I'm Black, and therefore I'm telling you that this is how this has impacted my life. So they're saying that there's this assumption that if you're Black and brown, that life has been more difficult for you. But we're saying that that's not true, that you have to kind of state somewhere that that's happening. And so people were talking about in essays that you can kind of say you're Black, but then you have to say how my Blackness has been more difficult for me.
So, in order to bypass systemic racism and its impact on my college admissions, I have to now explain systemic racism and its impact on my life in order to gain college admission.
And they're saying that that's one of the areas they're saying, we're not saying that from how I read it, we're not saying that your race may not be a factor. We're saying that just because you're Black, it doesn't mean it's a factor in this world, because we're going to race neutral,
Oh, we're
right?
back to post-racial America.
Yes. But what we're saying is that if you can kind of prove it, then that may be some wiggle room. So universities, Harvard did release a statement. I know a few other universities have already released statements saying, we are committed to this, and we're trying to figure out what this is going to look like.
Okay. 303 Creative LLC versus Elena's. Now, we've talked about this, but you explained this one way better than I do, because there were some pieces that I was missing about the fact that this case was built on a scenario that didn't even happen in real life.
Yes. There was a woman, I think her name is Lori Smith.
That's it.
Who
Yes.
owned a web design company. And one of the things that she said she wanted to put on her website was that she doesn't do stuff for gay folks. But she couldn't do that because of the state she was in did not allow for this level of discrimination. She then cited a case of that someone reached out to her saying, we want you to kind of do some type of graphic design stuff for us. One of the people was Stewart. We want you to, I think it was Stewart and Mike. We want you to do some graphic design stuff for us for our wedding. And, I'm Stewart and my partner is Mike. And so they said, see, this is one of those examples where I can't deny service to this person. And I should be able to say that I'm not going to provide services to this person because it goes against my religious beliefs. Well, one of the things is Stewart, they found him. He is married to a woman and said, I don't know how my name got in this. I never reached out to this woman. I don't know who she is. But the justices said it didn't matter if the person wasn't real that was being cited in there. And they said that not restaurants and hotels, but expressive businesses should have the right to decide that they don't want to provide their services to certain people if it goes against their beliefs.
And I guess for me,
especially with claims of religious freedom, is the biggest one.
Right. And again, I think the part of this that I struggle with, in addition to just the blatant discriminatory practices, I think the part of this that I struggle with is that we've elevated a what if to the level of Supreme Court, and the justices have actually ruled on it. And we know that it's a what if. We know that it didn't happen. And they still just kind of say, yeah, well, it could. And so I guess my question, and I probably should have reached out to an attorney for this, but I guess my question is, where are we now that we're ruling on, well, it could? Because that's a very slippery, dangerous slope.
They said that particular incident wasn't in reading one of them again, and that's more of an attorney thing. But when I read some of the articles, it said, the justices said that piece didn't matter. I think the biggest thing is that when we kind of talked about this line, specifically around oppression and marginalization and this tendency to other communities, that you have even Black and brown folks who were saying, they don't support the rights of gay people, and that, yes, I should have a right to. But we look at these slippery slopes of, if we're saying that you don't have to serve people in your expressive business, not hotels and restaurants, but in certain types of businesses, because of freedom of speech and
this was a revisit.
Freedom.
they did this with cake before.
Yes,
It was a
right.
bakery that
Different
didn't
court,
want to make a wedding cake for
different
takeout,
court,
and they
right.
shot that one down.
Different court. And so this is a different makeup of a court. And so, part of it is that we're sitting here, and if we're saying people can begin to not serve people because it goes against their beliefs and their freedoms, except for, they said, restaurants and hotels, they said expressive businesses, we then begin to look at how far is this going to go? And there's always, we have to begin to, as people, especially those who are on this continuum of marginalization and oppression and historically exclusion and intentional historical exclusion, recognize it's not okay for them to do it to someone who you feel deserves to be marginalized, oppressed,
Right.
because that same language, that same argument is going to be used for them to come for you. So kind of, we talked about certain members of the Asian community who kind of did that for Black and Brown and college admissions. Now we have to look at those of us who still fall in that BIPOC group, who are sitting here and saying, well, yes, no one cares about gay rights, and it doesn't matter if gay people should be able to. Do you think it's going to stop there either? Or is it this legislation is going to be cited to be able to then justify some level of discrimination and people not providing services to you?
And that's just not that's not a Pandora's box you want to open.
Mm-mm.
Because this is bringing me back to no blacks, no dogs need apply.
Mm.
When those signs used to be in the window very overtly and very openly during Jim Crow. And I guess the part that I really wish that the BIPOC community could understand is that once you start, no one is safe.
Mm-mm.
And so I guess that's the hardest part of this. And like we talked before, and my thing is, I guess for me, if this is your private business and you are a small business owner, you could have very well just said no. But you've now gone out of your way to say, wait, I know you didn't ask me.
Right. I'd say no to nobody.
Right. I know you didn't ask me, but now I need to make sure that you understand why I'm not taking your fake business.
And I think we also need to recognize that within the Black and Brown communities, we have LGBTQ members, right? So in this, as we're kind of looking at this stress, this continued othering, this societal acknowledgement and proclamations that we care nothing about you and we want to continue to exclude you from spaces and opportunities, how emotionally stressful that can be for these communities that are being impacted. And especially those who are sitting here and saying, I dealt with this affirmative action one as a Black person. Now as a member, I'm a Black, queer person. And now I'm dealing with this too. Like, know what you are doing, everything in your power to do as much as possible to exclude me from access to just things that humanity says I should have access to. And so we also must acknowledge that as well, that when it comes to the Supreme Court on this LGBTQ issue, those are still our people, right? Who are going to likely be even more impacted.
Or even still people.
Yes.
Like people, like they're still people before we even get into the piece around intersectionality.
Yes.
We're still talking about living, breathing humans.
Mm-hmm. And I just think that, one of the things as a psychologist, I am always saying when things like this happen is we as a community, it's okay to acknowledge our fear and our anxiety, our anger about what's happening. Because this is real for us, right? And to find those places and those people where you can have these conversations. And it is okay at times to step away from people who come and try to justify these things to you. Because I told someone the other day, when they were explaining it, and the person was like, well, I need you to give me, all of the facts, and I need data. And so the person said, here's a list of data. Well, I need you to give me more data. I said, they're not going to read the data, because we spend a lot of time, emotional and intellectual labor, trying to explain to people why this is harmful to us, to people who do not care. And so part of it is identifying, what do you need to deal with what's happening in this moment? And then also look at, where are the areas that you have opportunity to impact change? And that's where you spend your energy, and which is not on the person who says, I want you to give me a 15-page bibliography, of resources that state that it is true that Black people actually deserve to get into places of higher education, right? And so part of it is then, where do you put your energy in identifying, what can we do to kind of impact change? One of the things I always say is, elections have consequences. Part of the reason why we are here is there were decisions made by people to say, I'm just going to sit this one out. And here we are, right? And so we have to begin to look at, we are in this moment. Where do we go from here as a community, as a collective? And where do I get the emotional support to kind of deal with what all this means to me, and not own it, not begin to own these beliefs that have been put out there that says, people should be able to exclude me, to not own the fact that people are going to say, see, Black people don't deserve to be in these spaces. No, Black people deserve to be in these spaces. You're just not going to look for us again.
Right. So I guess in closing, what are 2 things that you want the impacted communities to know moving forward?
I think one is, don't own and internalize these problematic messages that you don't belong, because you do. Also, I think my other thing would be to find your people and find your space. But don't make it where, if you're finding your people and you're finding that space, that you're only in that space because you have to be. You deserve to be everywhere. And so, again, even when it comes to HBCUs, I love my HBCUs, but if that's not where you want to be, it shouldn't be that you feel you have to be someplace just because that's your only option, and you don't deserve to be everywhere that you have been. So I think that those would be the things that I would want people to know. And I always tell people, seek therapy if you need it. This is a lot. This is heavy. This is emotional. This is yet one more thing.
I was going to say, compounding
we are
dealing
already our racial trauma, our racial stress. This is one more thing. And for those who are at intersectional identities, this is one more thing. And so be willing to seek that additional professional support if you need it.
Okay. And how do we find you?
You can find me at Dr. Tiffany, DrTyffani, on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook, and then at MonfortDentConsulting.com.
Awesome. Thank you again. I appreciate you. There was nobody that I would rather break my hiatus with. So with that being said, I am Dr. Carolyn Strong. You have been watching Strong Conversations, Hot Takes from a Cultural Firebrand. Like the Facebook page at Strong Conversations. Go on over to the YouTube so you can watch past episodes at Strong Conversations. And always feel free to follow my shenanigans on Twitter at Dr. Carolyn Strong. Thank you again, Dr. Dent. And you have an amazing Independence Day. Stay independent. You've been listening to Strong Conversations, Hot Takes from a Cultural Firebrand. Make sure to like our Facebook page at Strong Conversations, or follow us on Twitter at Dr. Carolyn Strong. Until next time, have a good one.